Hello and welcome to this morning's Talk at 10. This morning we're exploring how the COVID-19 workplace is challenging advances in workplace equality. We'll be asking whether children being homeschooled yet again has additional childcare been evenly split between the genders? How have staff relatively lower down the pay scale and potentially without the proper facilities for a true home office fared? What has the impact on those with frontline key worker roles been? For business leaders, often grappling with survival of their enterprises, also navigating how to look after staff now working from home is the norm is a huge adjustment. For families, it's also a fundamental change in the dynamic of the home. In the next hour, I look forward to discussing the many dimensions of equality in the COVID-19 workplace with the help of my three panellists. They are Ruth Cadbury, MP for Brentford and Isleworth, Abdul Shiil, co-founder and director of Sahan Cares, and Karen Partridge, director of Plus Change Consulting and a fellow of the Chartered Institute for Personnel Development. Throughout the programme, my colleague Rowan, to whom I extend a warm welcome as it's his first programme, will be monitoring your questions. So please keep them coming in via email and the YouTube live chat window. Now, don't forget that the West London Business Support Helpline remains live. You can call out to the team at any time on 020 8607 2500. Our Talk at 10 webcasts are kindly supported by Better Futures, the Mayor of London's flagship programme to create a clean tech cluster in London. And if you're wondering whether your business might be eligible to apply for Better Futures, some of the key requirements are that you're an SME. So that means that you've got up to 249 employees and a turnover of under 50 million euros. You have a London address and that you have or you're about to develop a clean technology. That's any product that has a good impact on the environment. So if that sounds of interest to you and your business, please contact my colleague amelia.grant@westlondon.com to find out more. So let's get down to business. On the programme today, we're going to be covering, first of all, what we're witnessing in practice in this challenging area of equality and the COVID-19 workplace. We're then going to talk a bit about the parliamentary and legislative context. And finally, we're going to turn to some practical advice for business leaders. Before we dive into today's theme, I am going to put to all of the panel a question I ask most of my Talk at 10 panels of what it feels like out there on the ground, because a lot has changed in the past week. And I think we're just going to bring up on screen a reminder of the roadmap that has now been revealed by government. The hope that all being well, by the 29th of March, the rule of six or of two will allow meetings of households outdoors, but also we assume some business meetings coming through there. By the 12th of April, we're going to see retail unlocking. Great for our West London retail business community. Fast forward to the 17th of May, and gatherings up to 30 people outdoors are hoped for. And then perhaps the date on everyone's minds, the 21st of June, but at which point the remaining businesses, including nightclubs, will we hope be able to unlock, and there won't be any more legal limits on social contact. There'll probably still be a lot of advice in terms of trying to contain the continued risks of COVID. So a lot's changed this week. Can I turn first of all, Ruth, to you for your take on what it feels like out there on the ground, Ruth?
Well, I was asked this on Times Radio last night, and on the one hand, it's a strange question. I don't think I've left the house for 4 days. But obviously picking up from people, I think there is a positivity this time where there was a sense of despair 6 weeks ago. when we entered the current lockdown, because I think people are now seeing to be that there's a route. And I also think for once the government's got the messaging right, it's no earlier than this date and that date. And I think that's quite an important way of putting it, rather than being absolutely fixated on specific dates.
So sort of managing all of our expectations there with that sort of cautious overlay on the dates. I've certainly noticed that just with a bit more blue sky and sunshine over the past few days, everyone's perked up, which is good to see. Abdul, if I can bring you in, what's it felt like for you, your family and colleagues? Abdul.
I think for us as a care company, we've had many calls from family members actually excited about the roadmap. For many family members, we were their first point of contact. They were unable to visit their families because of lockdown. So for them, they just can't wait to reunite with their family members, particularly the elderly who've been shielding. Our clients are happy because they get to see their relatives. So everyone's really patient and cautious at the same time.
Yeah, no, I've certainly have seen some enthusiastic calls within my family at the news that there is perhaps an end in sight and glimmer of hope there. Karen, in your bit of West London, I think you're sat in Ealing this morning. What's it felt like?
Yes, well, I agree with Abdul and Ruth. There's definitely a more positivity around about the future since the roadmap, and also I think since the vaccine rollout began as well. I've noticed, certainly with the older generation who've had their vaccines, and it's giving them a future, and they're sort of looking forward. From work colleagues and clients, again, I think they can see a way forward. And also, they've been through a huge amount of transformation, in the workplace, and many have adopted well to this, home working. So there's, a question about, well, will we be able to continue to work this way in the future? We
don't want to lose the upsides of the change that has happened, which we'll explore more shortly. And you said to me earlier that you'd been out on your allotment yesterday. What was the mood of allotmenteers?
Indeed. Well, I noticed, we've had a long, hard winter on the allotment, and people have emerged, like survivors, and of course of the older generation. They're busy preparing for spring and having their vaccinations. So lots of talk about vaccinations and just generally, moving forward.
A lot of talk I've discovered of comparing who's had what type of vaccination seems
Indeed.
to be the order of the day. Well, without further ado, I'm going to take us on to our first theme of the morning, which is sort of, I think, is an extension of this as to what we're witnessing in practice. And I'm just going to share a few stats to kind of set the scene a bit for just how demanding these times have been for parents, but particularly it would seem mothers. So some research here from the Fawcett Society, who've highlighted that mothers in couples were over 1.5 times more likely than fathers to say that they were doing the majority of childcare during school and nursery closures. And then almost 62% of single mothers in their sample saying that they'd struggled to go to the shops due to their children being at home, compared with 39% of fathers. That was the Fawcett Society. And we turn to research by the TUC in January of this year. They're highlighting 78%, of working mothers not being offered furlough by their employer during the pandemic. 71% having furlough requests turned down. 48% fearing childcare responsibilities will lead to negative treatment at work, and just 18% having successfully reduced working hours to manage childcare during school closures. Really stark figures. And then from the New York Times, a bit of an international perspective, their research highlighting that 32% of women aged 25 to 44 in the US said that childcare was the reason for losing their payroll jobs, and 69% saying that they'd experienced adverse health effects due to the worry and stress of the pandemic, compared with 51% of fathers. So quite an extraordinary backdrop being revealed there. I have to say, a bit of good news. And we're going to share, I think, a photo of the Washington state-based aerospace manufacturer Orion, and the sort of news from them that they were able to dedicate some space in their empty call center offices, so that employees' children could attend remote school whilst their parents working, and the school was free. Parents had their work day reduced to 4 days, and then contributed that 5th day to helping oversee students in this learning pod environment that Orion have created. Now I'm going to turn, I think, first of all to Ruth, as it was in fact a conversation, a breakout room post the West London Business Awards this year, that led to you raising this important question of how home working has begun to halt or reverse gender equality progression. So I wonder whether you can kind of elaborate on that and your take on what's unfolding, and whether the conversations you've been having echo these really stark research findings. Ruth?
Yes, I mean, it was a really good idea to have breakout rooms, because it kind of made it was the equivalent of having a chat in the bar afterwards. The informality was good. So we were all talking about our experiences of lockdown, but I think it must have been just at the point that those findings you've just run through had come out, because although I'm not disadvantaged, not only I'm not homeschooling or child caring, I'm actually being fed by my eldest child every night. So, but obviously I've got friends, with quite senior positions on the front bench who are also homeschooling and have children in the background or on their laps or whatever. And I've got a staff member who's homeschooling as well. And, getting a sense of not only the actual juggling, but for those who are in a hierarchical employment organisation, worrying about how it's going to look, and also this sense that there's an inequality in many homes as to who's actually doing the childcare, and who's expected to move their working hours to when the kids are asleep and so on. And too often, women are doing more and more of the complex work, such as homeschooling, than men in many families. And then, of course, you've got the number of lone parents who are almost, who are the majority of whom are women. So, so we were chatting around this, and I'm really pleased. Thank you, Andrew, and your team for picking this up and using it as a theme for this session today.
Well, it certainly brought into focus the starkness of the reality out there for so many, and I have to say, over the past few weeks, it's inspired some lively conversations in our home and household as to, in fact, what cultural shifts may be required at Redesdale Gardens. Now I'm going to bring in Karen. Welcome to the programme. I think it's the first time we've had you on Talk 10, which is wonderful. Now, as a fellow of CIPD and also wearing your hat as director of Plus Change Consulting, what are you observing from your client work with regards to equality in the workplace, Karen?
Well, certainly what I'm seeing with my clients is borne out by the information, the data that you've just shown. Working parents and carers during lockdown have been forced to try to balance working from home and childcare and caring duties, and for many it's been a real struggle. And the responsibilities have usually fall on the women. So I'm seeing that there's been sort of not just crisis management in businesses, but crisis management in the home as well. So also noticing that home working is overall seems to be welcomed by many, and they've made the transition to home working quite well in some cases. But for others, it's also been a case, a moment of great isolation, particularly, with the furloughing. And I'm struck by when people have been furloughed, the very poor communication or sort of check-ins between, that individual and the team and line manager in that period. So this, it's been for some, a very isolating experience, I think, and poor communication hasn't helped.
The very different stories for different individuals and families, which I suppose is again borne out in the data. Do you think there's a particular role for business leaders in addressing these challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the role of leaders at this period is really important. And I have noticed some leaders, shall we say, go into a retreat, which I think is easy to do when everything becomes virtual and online. There was a recent MBS intelligence report on the impact of COVID and on gender, race and ethnic diversity in the hospitality and leisure industry. And it found that although 72% of business leaders in that industry believe that diversity and inclusion remains a priority, only 15% reported that it was being raised at board level. So this is an issue which it really needs to be on the board table on a sort of day-to-day basis, and leaders really need to be seen walking the talk. And leaders have the privilege of influencing culture and behaviour in their organisations. There's a lot of opportunity there, I think, for leaders to shift the culture around these issues and behaviour.
You're reminding me on that front how you of course spent time at the BBC, and I think it was Greg Dyke, when he was Director General, was famous. Did he introduce yellow cards or red cards in meetings to
absolutely, yes,
prompt some
yes,
change?
There was the Cut the Crap campaign, I remember. Well.
Yeah, so a very practical example, and of course someone with strong links to West London beyond the BBC. He was also chair of Brentford FC for many years. Now I'm going to bring Abdul into the conversation. Abdul's co-founder and director of Sahan Cares, who were runner-up for Company of the Year at the West London Business Awards 2021 just a few weeks ago. So congratulations again, Abdul, on that achievement. Sahan Cares, you're providing domiciliary and personal care and support for clients and families across West London. Can you give us a bit of a flavour, first of all, of the makeup of your workforce? Abdul.
So yeah, Sahan Cares, we are a family-run home care agency. We're also a social enterprise, and we offer our care really by majority of our workforce come from a refugee and Black and ethnic minority background. So we train them in-house, we give them the necessary English skills that they need, and then that's what we use when we send them as carers to the community. And yeah, we've been running for almost 10 years, based in West London. And
when we were catching up the other day, you were telling me how many of the staff are single parents and single mothers, particularly. How do you kind of lock in the pressures that they may have in their family lives with your needs as a business and your clients? How do you design a schedule that works for everyone?
Yeah, so the majority of our workforce are single mothers, and they have to be mom and dad for their kids. And it's been really, really tough on them. Pre-pandemic, we've always been a pro-flexible employer. The care industry is notorious for giving out 0-hour contracts. We were totally against that, because we feel like staff need to have that sense of reassurance and sense of flexibility. What tends to happen in the care industry is, for example, if you're a carer, you are expected to work from 6 in the morning to 10 at night. any time throughout that time. But then if you've got a family to raise, it's not possible to do that. So from early, what we decided to do is we've actually asked our staff who likes to work in the morning and who likes to work in the evening. So then some people said, you know what, I'd much rather work in the morning because I've got little ones I need to pick up from school. Others actually said, you know, my kids are actually teenagers. I don't mind working the evening because they can stay at home. So doing things like that, in a way, helped us. Again, the care industry is notorious for high staff turnover, but we've had our carers, over 90% of our carers have been with us for over 5 years. And we find that it's because we are a flexible employer, because we actually care not just about the work, but about their well-being. Having that type of culture is what Karen mentioned earlier. It's so important, and that it's really embedded within our organization.
It's fantastic to hear, and also I thought there a really interesting point you made as to how demands on parents will shift as children get older, and actually with that diversity of members of your staff with kids at different ages, that can all be very complementary, I suppose, to being able to put together a timetable that works for everyone. You mentioned when we spoke a few days ago.
Yeah,
go on, Abdul.
No, sorry, I was just agreeing with you.
Good, excellent, thumbs up. When we were talking the other day, you were reflecting on the pandemic and its particular impacts on your staff. Do you want to share a bit more as to how you've had to respond to those new pressures on your team and what support you've provided, Abdul?
Yeah, so prior to the pandemic, like I mentioned, we've always been a pro-flexible employer, but then the pandemic made us really look at ourselves. Okay, how can we do more for our carers? They're going through a lot. You've got homeschooling, you've got the idea of going into the community, thinking about how can I not give COVID to my client? All that mental pressure is really hard on them. So what we decided to do is we've decided to get a professional psychotherapist, and we've been doing sort of a therapy Thursday type of a well-being Thursday for our carers, and we've been running that for months now. And this is culturally appropriate therapist session, and majority of our carers come from the Somali community, so we've got someone that's licensed. And initially they were against it because there's this whole taboo in our culture about speaking about your feelings. You're supposed to be tough and you're supposed to be strong, and you cannot talk about your feelings and all those connotations. But we found that, after the first session, they loved it. They were able to tap into previous forms that they had as former refugees, things that they've never really spoke about. They were able to deal with. And we found that that's been extremely helpful for them, because looking after their well-being for us is so important, because they're looking after other people. So if we can focus on just looking after them and how they feel, they'll be able to go to work, they'll be able to communicate better with the kids. And again, we're breaking a cycle where families are now talking about mental health with their kids, whereas before they weren't doing that. So again, we're breaking the cycle. So you've got a new generation of people who are openly talking about their feelings to their parents.
Well, that's fantastic to hear, and another reason why you secured the prize title in this year's awards. Now, I'm going to move us on to our second theme of the morning, which is just to look briefly at the parliamentary and legislative context. And for that, I'm going to bring Ruth back in to share with us a little bit of some of the results of a recent committee that's been sort of reflecting in this area. That's, I think, sort of reported at the end of last month. So some initial findings. Ruth, tell us more.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. This is the Women and Equalities Select Committee. So it's one of the statutory select committees of Parliament. It's a committee I used to sit on. I now sit on Transport Committee. But they produced a report that was released on the 24th of January called Coronavirus and the Gendered Economic Impact. This is the impact of inequality through COVID is laid on top of already quite significant labour market and structural and caring inequalities that have been faced by women and have been growing in recent years. So, and of course, this is going a lot wider than merely the issues and pressures of working from home, which we've discussed. But they started by saying that many recommendations for government that the government schemes should have had, and any future ones should have, an equalities impact assessment, which is based on evidence from existing inequalities. They should understand that some investment plans, many of the investment plans have skewed towards male-dominated sectors. And they've also saying the flexible work. Abdul's story is just wonderful. What a caring and sensitive employer, but one that's going to be good for his business in the long run, absolutely. But the flexible working regulations, which currently you're not eligible for if you haven't been working for an employer for 26 weeks, saying that restriction should be dropped. The committee was also saying that the £20 uplift on universal credit should be retained because that benefits far more women than men. And also statutory sick pay. Women are overrepresented in the groups who are not eligible for statutory sick pay, such as those on 0 hours contracts. Extending redundancy payments to pregnant women and new mothers, and looking at the availability and affordability of childcare, not only for those in work, but possibly also for those who are seeking work and are on training. And we're really worried about the impact of the coronavirus on nursery businesses. And I've spoken to nursery businesses locally who are worried that they may go out of business, and we may come out of the pandemic with far fewer nursery places locally, which is another concern of mine. And finally, the committee. Now, this is a cross-party committee, of which over half the members will be Conservatives. They unanimously felt that they expressed concern about the dismissive attitude of the Equalities Minister towards her role, and made some specific recommendations about how government addresses equalities in a stronger way. Standard use of equalities impacts assessment, which have been dropping by the wayside. They quietly dropped the gender impact assessment requirement that has only not long been in law. And I think finally, and I think we've all noticed how male dominated those press conferences are, and the top level decisions are generally being led by men. The Prime Minister generally has men around him making the key decisions, and I think that kind of impacts all the way down. And we have that has a trickle down effect. So I hope that's useful.
Yeah, no, lots for us to reflect on there, and actually some really specific recommendations being made there for government to pick up by that cross-party select committee, as you say. And I think some points there that we may come back to as I bring Karen and Abdul into the conversation. Now, Karen, you've pointed out to me that being a carer is not a protected characteristic, and I wonder whether you can tell us a bit more about what that means in practice, and why the CIPD as a professional body has been pushing for change in this area. Karen.
Yes, it's surprising, isn't it, that being a carer in this day and age is not a protected characteristic under the 2010 Equality Act. Just a reminder of protected characteristics are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion and beliefs, and sex. However, within that framework, sort of embedded in the law, is if you are looking after someone who is elderly or disabled or in fact ill, because illness is now covered by as a protected characteristic, in law, the law will protect you against direct discrimination or harassment because of your caring responsibilities. So this is because that you are counted as being an associate with someone who is protected by law because of their age or disability or illness. So that's how things are.
Interesting. It sounds like maybe through sort of case law, things are broadening out a bit there.
Yeah.
But you do wonder how well that is understood by employers and employees alike.
And in fact, if you consider what's going on in society at the moment, many of us are becoming almost a sandwich generation. As soon as our parenting duties are finished, then it's our elderly parents care that we have. I have two parents, very fortunate. We're both in their 90s. So it's almost a lifetime of care now for people. So and inevitably, as we know, the pandemic has really thrown a sort of a light on the plight of carers as well. So it's something which needs to be revisited, and the CIPD, I know, have put together several white papers, and also organisations like Carers UK are pretty sort of activist in this area as well.
And I suppose for business leaders, it's sort of getting your head around, in a sense, those life sort of phases. You describe it as a sandwich, but how employees that will perhaps with you for the long term and have got deep organisational knowledge may transition from children at different ages to, as you say, as soon as the children have left home or off to university, onto apprenticeships, etc., they may then have that parental care responsibility kick in. So a very kind of holistic approach, perhaps needed. Now I'm going to just bring up on the screen, before I pull Abdul into the conversation, a reminder of the flexible working legislation that Ruth touched upon. That all employees have the legal right to request. I think we should emphasise perhaps flexible working, not just parents and carers. And there's a process of making a statutory application that employees can trigger, and then employees must have worked, as Ruth highlighted, the same employer for at least 26 weeks to be eligible to make that application. Clearly, the select committee suggested that could be removed. But I have to say, we found ourselves intrigued by it simply being a right to request, and whether in the changing world we're now in, whether that's perhaps rather weak, when there is clearly a reality that so many employers have been absolutely reliant on a flexible workforce through COVID-19 to survive. I wonder, Abdul, with your own experience of flexible working, what your take is on that bit of legislation and whether it's time for change. Abdul.
Flexibility again is embedded within our culture. We trust our carers and they trust us. We've got their backs and they've got our backs. And trust is super important, in my opinion. Just for an example, we've had someone, one of us started with us just I think it was last year, a new carer who started working for us. And within just a couple of weeks, she came into our office and, she sat down with my mom, because mom is the boss, obviously, in the organization, our family business. And she told her, hey, listen, my daughter is in the process of going to university. However, there's a tuition in North London that I'm going to have to drive to every day. We're based in Hillingdon, so we're gonna have to drive there. Is it possible if I can do that? So mom, that's fine. And guess what? We'll even help you with the fuel, the distance between going there. So that, so long story short, grades came out. The girl is now going to Oxford University. She's done her first year at Oxford University. Showing empathy, being a flexible organization is super, super, super important. And now now this particular carer is one of our best carers that we have, because, from the moment she came in, she saw that actually we trusted her and we treated her not just as a carer, but as a part of the family. And every time and she would always get cards sent to our office. Our clients would always send cards to the office thanking that carer for the work that they're doing.
Well, that's a wonderful story.
There's a ripple effect.
Absolutely wonderful. And so I suppose, coming to the chase, you clearly don't run away from flexible working policies at all, and see it as a right and responsibility that goes both ways between you as an employer and your employees.
Yeah, flexibility shouldn't be seen as a weakness. Supposed to, we see ourselves as a human-centric organization, not only for our clients but for our carers. And again, as a social mission, we're trying to uplift our community. And how can we do that if we're not flexible? So it's really and truly embedded within our organization.
Yeah, I think you've captured that beautifully in that turn of phrase. Now I'm going to bring Rowan in, who's been tracking by email and on YouTube chat our viewer questions. Do you have a sort of a first question, Rowan, you'd like to put to a member of the panel?
Yes, I do. This one's from James. I think it's probably geared towards Karen and Ruth, but brings Abdul in as well, because you're such a good example of how employers can be flexible. It's how can we encourage low-paid and zero-hour contract employees to make use of their rights to time away from work without feeling that pressure of losing work? So maybe aimed at larger employers who don't have that sort of personal connection to their employees. How can they encourage their employees to take time away from work when needed?
Karen, do you want to come in on that?
Yes. So I'm speaking obviously from the HR perspective, and I would, as an HR professional, and I suppose, again, it's variable, sort of the presence of HR within organisations, but I would be encouraging, employees to, I'd be checking in with employees to see how they're coping in these times, and bringing in supporting plans to support them, but also I think would be encouraging employees to speak up about these issues and to seek advice and help, to find their voice and to be proactive.
I was very struck, Karen, by that message. I was very struck by that message from Abdul of flexibility being seen as a strength for everyone. And I suppose it's if as business leaders, we collectively we can land that message and make and frame our organisational culture in those terms. I suppose that may then help give lower paid staff that may feel a bit less secure in their jobs and the confidence that this is a conversation that can be had.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. I mean, leaders, one thing leaders should be doing at the moment is measuring the impact of their people processes, and monitoring things such as furloughing and redundancy programs, particularly on women and people of ethnic minorities. This is really important people data to understand how organisations can, put in plans to support employees. And
what's really happening, I suppose, on the front line of your business when the rubber hits the ground.
Yeah.
Ruth, what are your thoughts on this question?
Well, obviously anybody listening in today is going to be realise there's a challenge for them, and they want to do their best by their staff, and unfortunately we're seeing examples where that's not the case. And I'm talking about flexible working. I've had constituents who work for Border Force at Heathrow, which up until recently did enable people to book their shifts according to their personal needs, and that's now been removed. Now, in a normal job market, that means they'll lose staff to people, to employers who are prepared to be flexible. And of course, I think understanding the fear of staff, particularly those in the lower pay, who are lower paid or are on 0 hours contracts, I think recognizing that fear of losing their jobs, which I think is far worse even now, because up until recently we've been a high employment area, I think that has to be understood. Of course, as a Labour MP, I would say join a trade union. My big concern, the other big issue, which again, I hope everybody listening is probably on top of and supports staff to self-isolate. One of the drivers for infection has been people who are in workplaces where infection is inevitable, but don't want to get tested, or because they're so afraid of the implications of having to self-isolate for 10 days, not probably, even if they are eligible for sick pay, £90 a week hardly doesn't cover the rent, let alone feeding the family. So I really think employers need to be aware of why staff may make decisions that those of us who have luxury might think are risky in terms of a virulent infection like COVID. So I'm sorry that's not exactly answering your question, but it did give me a chance to bring in a couple of issues that I think need to be in this debate.
No, I'd agree. Some key points there around job security and that challenge of can many people not being able to afford not to work in the current times. Now I'm going to take us on swiftly onto the third and final sort of theme of this morning's programme, which is perhaps the most important. How do we translate all of these concerns that we've aired into practical change and indeed advice to our business community, which, as I said at the top of the hour, I think has a real struggle to keep pace with both business survival and this sort of huge cultural change overlaid at the same time. And just to get the conversation started, we took on Ruth's challenge of drafting some initial advice for our members and the wider business community. And I'm going to just rattle through some of the headlines of our sort of first stab at sort of practical advice for business leaders. So on this theme of leadership and perhaps first of all evaluating your company culture and policies, our suggestion is that leaders need to be considering whether they're observing good work-home balance in their own teams. Reflecting, are you in practice rewarding workaholic behaviours? If you are, in practice, does that mean that you're shunting business costs onto families and wider society? And flowing on from that, do your performance management systems reward over-delivery or a more balanced work-home life? The CIPD suggest managing with a focus on outputs rather than inputs. And I suppose on a very practical day-to-day level, reflect on the impact of particularly very last-minute task requests on staff. Do you actually have a culture where a member of staff can push back and say, much as I'd like to do this, my family commitments this evening don't allow it. Moving on to the next slide, how do we actually lead this cultural change? Suggestions that perhaps using team meetings to initiate a discussion around how team members will achieve a good work-home balance in the week ahead. Is there anything stopping it? And perhaps business leaders starting the discussion with their own challenges and plan. The need to give people permission to take toil or other rewards after busy periods, which inevitably will crop up in most businesses, and making sure that those rewards are aligned to staff members' particular personalities and life circumstances. Something that I think has been discussed a fair bit over the past few years, of being alert to the impact of late night emails, and that perhaps being an indicator that work-home balance isn't being achieved. Where that crops up, discuss it with a member of staff. But bear in mind, one size doesn't fit all. And for some, of course, a late night email might be part of a desired flexible working model. And some additional ideas. Consider a policy of no work emails from 8 p.m. and through to 8 a.m. except in absolute emergencies. There is a delayed send function that can be used in Outlook, which avoids colleagues' phones pinging in the night. Could you welcome children joining internal company calls as long as they're well behaved and non-disruptive, or disruptions kept to a minimum. This can help both men and women fulfill childcare responsibilities and provide work experience, virtual work experience. At PwC, they're offering all employees the option to move to a part-time or 4-day schedule, which I think echoes CIPD's advice to look at special leave, reduced hours, with no impact on pay if the business can afford it, or the ability to purchase additional leave and spread the cost over the year. CIPD also suggests clearing times in calendars for parents, perhaps also carers, to homeschool, knowing that they won't be disturbed or expected to attend meetings. And finally, we suggest a test. Ask yourself the question as to whether men and women in your workforce are feeling able to do their fair share of the housework, cooking, washing, childcare. And in that, of course, men have a personal responsibility, of course. If you are getting that extra time from your employer, it's not there to sit in front of the TV all night. Perhaps there's a role for male leaders to relay their own stories of how they're doing their fair share to help that normalization of a behavior change. So that was our initial sort of starter for 10. I'm going to bring in, I think, Abdul first of all for your take on whether that feels like a sort of a realistic, reasonable set of principles for employers to start thinking about in this area. Is there anything we need to change? Do you think we've missed something? What are your thoughts, Abdul?
So I think you've listed it beautifully over during the slides. From my personal perspective, what I think coming out of this pandemic, we've got to care more about the well-being of our staff. We've got to be I'm so big on being a human-centric organization and caring not just for profit. Profit is also great, but we've also got to think about the well-being of the people that we have. And it goes back to the culture. What culture do we want to have in our organizations? For us, it's a family culture, and we're proud of that. And we want to continue that. We want to do more for the well-being of our staff because, again, we see it as a differentiator. And it's what throughout the last for nearly 10 years, we've never spent a pound on hiring everyone. And people have always come to us through word of mouth. And we're proud of that because of the initiative that we're doing. And we want to do more of that. So coming out of this, I feel like businesses that focus on the well-being of their staff, the mental health of their staff, are the ones that I feel like will do good, hopefully going forward.
And what's your sense on, as I think our one male panelist this morning, what's your sense as to the extent to which this is a conversation that needs to be happening with men to help facilitate this change and between men?
I think, men, we have to be more vocal, we have to, I guess, point these things out when we see it. And the more we're talking about it, the more it will hopefully become normal. And these connotations that we all have needs to stop. These subconscious bias that we have needs to stop. And then moving forward, hopefully we will see a new day of people that are supporting each other. In my opinion.
Thank you. Karen, can I bring you back in? What's your take as an HR professional? Did our emerging recommendations fill you with horror, or are those points you think could be and should be discussed in management teams?
I think it's a great list. You've really, you've captured really what needs to happen. It also reminded me of what a sort of momentous task it is to do, for employees to really pay attention to all these needs. So, but I think, there's something around, the thing I suppose missing from that list would be maybe something that Abdul mentioned, which is trust. Employers need to begin to trust their employees, they need to listen to their needs and to have a listening ear for things like around diversity and fairness, and to develop plans to support employees going forward. So, and also I think there's a real, in the past we know there's been a real hesitancy to embrace flexible working. We know that only sort of before pre-pandemic, only 50% of organisations would acknowledge that they had flexible working practices. And also, only 5% of the workforce was working from home. We know now it's sort of 85%. So it's been it's a huge change, and I think within those changes, it's it's worth considering how you continue the positive changes that have happened in the pandemic as well, and that again comes from listening to and consulting with your employees.
Yeah, no, those numbers certainly put in stark relief the huge cultural leap that we've all been living through here, and why we're perhaps starting to write these sorts of policies for the first time.
Exactly.
Ruth, can I bring you back in as you set us the challenge of trying to start to sketch out some policies for businesses in this area? Do you think we're getting close? What are the gaps?
Yes, I think that was a really good list, and obviously because we get taxpayer support for our teams, and we've had some additional funding, we've put a lot of that in practice. I like to think so anyway. I think one of the good things to come out of COVID is getting away from the culture of presentism, so that I think far more employers, particularly employers who were reluctant to embrace working from home, I think that's shifted completely, and
we may have just lost Ruth there. The tech gremlins eating up our bandwidth and connections in West London this morning. What a shame. Well, Ruth may manage to re-establish her connection before we hit the top of the hour. But in the meantime, I'm going to bring my colleague Rowan back in for another question from our viewers. Rowan.
Yeah, thank you. This is a question from Anita. How do you think, with vaccinations coming in, how do you think employers can best balance employees wanting to transition back to office working with those employees that want to continue working from home full time? To both Karen and Abdul. Good
question. Abdul, have you been having conversations in your organisation around the impact of who's been vaccinated, who hasn't? Does that change things for you at all?
So for us, we actually took a survey. We actually surveyed our staff back in November, asking them who was up for taking the vaccine, because again, the majority of our staff come from the Black and minority background. So we knew early there is going to be some hesitancy. So in November, we took a survey, and we found that only 37% of them wanted to take it. Again, so for us, we figured out, okay, that's a problem because we're in the care industry. It needs to be higher than that. So through the help of our psychotherapists and amongst other initiatives, we were able to was able to sort of bust these myths and rumors around the importance of taking the vaccination. And now we're on 95% of people who have taken the vaccine, and now they've gone to the community and they're telling everyone to take it. So they're the carers are acting as brand vaccine ambassadors within the community, and are telling people, there's nothing wrong with taking it at all. And there's also been that talk about which type of vaccine did you take? Did you take Pfizer? Did you take AstraZeneca? So there's also that comment that you mentioned earlier. Yeah, so hope for us, it's important that all our carers obviously take their vaccines, because obviously we're trusted to look after family members and relatives, and we're just proud that we've had a high uptake of staff.
That's fantastic to hear, and I think you just rightly spotlight the need for us all to kind of work to boost the confidence across the community that the vaccines are indeed safe. Karen, what are your thoughts on that question from Rowan?
Yes, it's I mean, I think businesses want to encourage employees to take the vaccines. I mean, just from their own well-being and health perspective. In terms of returning to the office, and again, I think that's, it's a conversation around the well-being needs and, the particular circumstances of the individual. And so I think there should be flexibility. Yeah, I mean, we're not prescribing, vaccine passports, so I think we have to work with the situation is that some people may need more persuasion to have vaccines than others. But in the meantime, I think in the workplace, we can certainly be flexible.
So perhaps comes back to our theme of the day of trust and flexibility as a strength. Now, Ruth, I think, has rejoined us, which is fantastic. So I'll just, before we hit the top of the hour, back to Ruth, perhaps for some of your final thoughts on where we can be moving all this forward, and any final bits that you thought were missing from our recommendations to employers. Ruth.
I think the point about men taking responsibility and taking leadership and not leaving things to do with women or gender just to the women, and ditto anything to do with BAME employers just to the BAME employees. You've got to change an organisation from the top through leadership. And I could ask that of you, Andrew. But also, I think your list of recommendations was really comprehensive, but it applied to desk-based staff who may or may not be working from home. And remember that a large number of your staff, or for many employers, businesses, many staff are not, doing jobs that can't be done from home. And also, you have contractors, even if it's just the cleaners. Is your leadership around the issue of equality also applying to the contractors you use as well, and can you set a good example in terms of your relationship with them?
Really useful thoughts there, Ruth. I think for us to end our hours of discussion on trying to really drive it through the supply chain, that importance of leadership. I have to say the irony wasn't lost on me that I was writing and drafting some of these policies at 9 o'clock at night. So I think I've probably got some toil to be taking today, to spend a bit more time with my young family. But for now, just to say a huge thank you, as always, to my production team, Joel at Revolution Audio and Rowan at WLB. Thank you to our guests this morning, Ruth Cadbury MP for Brentford and Isleworth, Abdul Shiil, co-founder and director of Sahan Cares, and Karen Partridge, fellow of the CIPD and director of Plus Change Consulting. As always, continue to share your thoughts with us and visit coronavirus.westlondon.com for the latest information and support. To speak to a member of the team about your concerns, call us on 020 8607 2500. If you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, please click on the button below the video stream to stay informed and show your support for our work. Talk at 10 will be back soon, covering another hot topic in this fast developing business landscape. Until then, as always, we wish you, your friends, family, and colleagues good health, and please maintain social distancing wherever possible to stay safe.